stay clear, this question is dangerous. Then the same method was employed against the President of the Chamber of Deputies, critical about the statement of the leader. He has been invited by Il Giornale to conform under threat of reopening some old and presumed sexual scandals. Now,
Ezio, I have to, you're reading a speech which is very eloquent and true.
But the last question,
okay, one more point.
We have, my position at the end is, we have freedom of press in Italy, obviously. But what about the quality of this freedom?
I feel the need to say a kind word about Berlusconi.
You do?
Well, somebody has to speak up for Berlusconi, and the one thing I will say on his behalf is, if it wasn't for him, what would you have to write about?
No, I don't mean by cutting you off a bit to say that this is anything but a dire and serious situation, because I know it is, and you've spoken very eloquently about it. Let me switch gears a bit. We've been painting a varied picture of the actual state of journalism economically and its future, but a quite rosy picture of the notional role of journalism in free societies. In a sense, the consensus of the group is, if we have freedom, if we have resources, we can do wondrous things for democracy. So I want to, as we get toward the end of this panel, ask everyone to be a little more self-critical, or in Paul's case, critical, and say, how can journalists, what are we screwing up? What are we doing badly, purely for reasons of our own fallibility, and what could we be doing better?
Well, I have some practice in the art of mea culpa at the New York Times, so I'll go first. I mean, one of the first chores that I had when I took this job was to examine the coverage that the New York Times had done in the run-up to the war in Iraq, and some of that coverage was truly bad. It was credulous. I mean, I generally think that where serious media are most likely to go wrong is by subscribing to the conventional wisdom too easily, by failures of skepticism. Sometimes we veer over to the other extreme and we become outright cynical, and that's not healthy for public discourse either. But in the case of the question of whether or not Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction, the media and the Times in particular were, insufficiently skeptical. One thing I will say in our defense is that belatedly and ultimately we did own up to that fact, and there is an element of, I mean, newspapers, and we're mostly talking about newspapers here, are put out by human beings, and they make stupid mistakes, and they get large questions wrong at least as often as they get small questions wrong. But then we have a newspaper the next day and the day after where we have the opportunity to try and set things right.
Other thoughts on this? Does anybody else want to step up?
Well, I think there is a lot to be desired about the average quality of journalism everywhere. And I don't think we need to idealize it or romanticize it. But there is evidence, and here let me just cite some social science studies that have tried to determine what factors best predict the level of political corruption in a country. And it turns out that it's not the level of economic development. It's not a lot of other factors. It turns out that the single best predictor of political corruption is a combined measure of freedom of the press and newspaper circulation per capita. So the more free circulation of newspapers, the more circulation of independent newspapers, the lower the level of political corruption. Now, it seems to be true in spite of the fact that not all newspapers are doing investigative reporting. Not all newspapers are of high quality, but still, with all the imperfections, there is that relationship. And that is that's what gives me some confidence that even with many things imperfect about newspapers, they still perform that essential function that we need.
I'll ask everyone for a final statement, but before that, just to answer my own question a bit, and this is where I want to be more hopeful about the advent of the internet than people have, well, there's been variability. Walter Lippmann, an American political philosopher and to some extent a journalist, or certainly the only person in the history of American journalism for whom the claim could be made that he was a political philosopher, wrote back in the 1920s comparing journalism to a restless searchlight. That to me is structurally the biggest flaw of journalism, and there's not much you can do about it, even with the kind of large, thriving news organizations that we've idealized, just because there's so much going on in the world. In my now, I don't even want to say how many years being in journalism, what strikes me is the kind of short attention span. There's an ability to provide an intensity of attention and investigation and bringing things to the attention of the public and agenda setting that's really wonderful, but it tends, even with the best-hearted journalists, to be quite short-lived. Many realms get ignored, and then on to the next thing. I don't see a good answer to that question in the construct of big news organizations, and therefore I think a proliferation of smaller, more specific news organizations, which may be publicly supported or nonprofit supported, would be a good idea. If, for example, that were the case, you might have had people full-time covering bank regulatory agencies in the early part of the decade now ending, in a way that newspapers did, even the best newspapers, well, but sporadically, just because that doesn't rank having a full-time reporter assigned. So that's where I want to be hopeful about, one of the areas where I want to be hopeful about the new world that's emerging. I'll just go down the line and ask everybody to give closing thoughts, because we're a few minutes before the end. Bodo?
Also, ich möchte gerne meinen allerersten Satz.
I want to repeat my very first sentence, if I may. For me, free media and free journalism is not something we do for democracy or in a democracy, but it is democracy itself. And I can't imagine the one without the other. And after I heard the war scenarios from Italy, I mean, I was surprised to hear that, I have to say. I mean, we know a certain degree of things, but listening to that is shocking. And I cannot understand why the EU doesn't dig into this much more intensely than they do so far. And I have to honestly say, that kind of thing always motivates me, that we try to get our act together here, that we sit here together. There are European institutions. I mean, I'd written to the Council of Europe about things happening in Southeastern Europe. I have not seen developments in Italy or even in France in that same light. But I think we should invite publishers and journalists in those countries to report those things, because they could be early warning indicators of a trend that we'll get elsewhere. I mean, we have people buying bits here and they're buying their way into newspapers. We see it everywhere. I think media are transport agents of social processes within a society, and at the same time part of that very society. And that is why I think the messenger is part of the message. That shows the influence that you can have, but that also shows the degree of ambivalence that we have to deal with. I mean, that requires responsible action. We also have to control one another. I mean, media have their media pages where they write about their colleagues. I think that's a good development. And when you are asking about a core message for journalism from here on, during a works assembly, I recently said God keep us from rain and storm and boring colleagues.
That's good advice. Paul?
Well, all of the different perils of journalism, the Italian peril, the peril of the Russian oligarch model, and the economic dangers in the United States that the news media faces in some other countries. I mean, all of those should not be taken as an indication of inevitable decline. I meant my discussion more as a warning, and I think all of these are warnings about the various ways in which independent democracy, independent journalism, vital for democracy, can die. But we can do things about those perils, and that is the message to take away from this. These are warnings.
But very simply, if you are in the first lane in a public cultural discussion about the idea of democracy, with the power against your idea of democracy, you must to be determined but careful, because the mistakes can become very dangerous. You must to be complete in all the other items of the newspapers, reliable, with a lot of coverage about the world, about the country, about others' problem. But journalistic investigation is the first. Today, journalistic investigation for us is the first. And the answer of readers is positive, very positive, for luck.
Yeah. Well, we've been talking a lot today about the role of stewards, of the owners of newspapers and the editors and publishers of newspapers and prime ministers and the people in power, and what their responsibility should be and how they should react to these dire warnings. And I guess I would just pause for a second to say we should put a little bit of faith in the citizens, the readers. I'm not an economist, but I tend to believe most of the time in the law of supply and demand, that if something is demanded loudly enough by the marketplace or the citizenry, it will be eventually supplied, maybe imperfectly, but it will be supplied. And I think that applies to journalism. I think it also applies to democracy.
That's great. Thank you. It's been wonderful to be here today. It's been wonderful to be here these few days in Vienna under the auspices of the Institute for Human Sciences. And one of the many ways in which it's been wonderful is on this panel, one gets an inspiring view of some combination of the realities and the possibilities of what I would call professionalized or institutionalized journalism, more so than at least I get day in, day out, particularly in the very populist America of this moment. So it's wonderful to leave with a notion of what the ideal is, and this will put us about the work of achieving it or preserving it with even more determination. Thanks, everyone. Thanks, panelists, for being here.